In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
I will admit that for some time now, I've actually had difficulty with these types of healing stories. That difficulty, which I see in myself and in others, can stem from a couple of different things. Sometimes it's our shared modern sensibilities that don't quite know what to make of miracles. Other times it's because of the discomfort that can come with addressing illness or suffering in any context. But I've realized that my main problem arises when I try to see myself in these stories, living 2,000 years after Jesus' earthly ministry of healing. I have no problem looking back on passages like this as a wonderful event that happened once and has been history ever since. But what's in the story that helps us learn about God, or life as a Christian, or our own spirituality? Well, to explore one way of answering that, I'd like to think about how we approach today's gospel passage. There are a couple of ways we could do that. We could think about it as two stories that are loosely connected. So then Jairus' sick daughter is in one story and the woman in the crowd has her own. Or we could think about the passage as one unified story. I think that's actually more helpful. In the Gospel of Mark, this two stories in one pattern happens a few times. Typically, it starts when Jesus does something dramatic, but before we or the disciples can understand what just happened, our attention is redirected to another event. Then after that's all sorted out, Jesus goes back and explains or finishes what he started at the beginning. Biblical scholars have quite a few names for this pattern in Mark, but my favorite is when they call it a Markan sandwich, which makes sense because one story is sandwiched between the ends of another, but together they actually make up one unified whole. So let's explore the passage as one story. Jesus is traveling, as he often does, with a large crowd in tow. Soon a man disrupts the flow of the crowd, a man named Jairus. He's a synagogue leader, meaning that he is a recognizable religious figure in the community. He's probably pretty wealthy, and he has both religious and social connections. He's a man who is typically used to getting what he wants when he wants it. But his daughter is seriously ill. Even with his connections and his financial resources and the best doctors around, Jairus can't stop tragedy from entering his life. He probably thinks that he's run out of options, so when he sees Jesus, Jairus makes a beeline through the crowd, falls to his knees, and begs Jesus to come and heal his daughter. Here, Jairus shows both faith and humility. He has faith that Jesus is powerful enough to heal illness, and so he humbles himself before the whole community by falling to his knees. So off Jesus goes with the crowd. Everyone is hurrying to stay with Jesus, to have a front seat for whatever he does next. The whole group shares a singular purpose, to reach Jairus' daughter in time. But then Jesus halts with no warning, whips his head around a few times, and says, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, as readers of Mark's gospel, we know what just happened. We know that a woman who had experienced hemorrhages wanted to be healed too. We know that she had undergone failed treatments for 12 years, and she was now destitute because of those healthcare expenses. We know that she sneaked up behind Jesus, so confident in his power that all she thought was necessary was to touch his cloak. She was right. The connection between her faith and Jesus' power enabled her healing. So we have the inside scoop here. But in the moment, as the crowd experiences this, Jesus must look absurd, because all they see is him stopping dead in his tracks, looking around and saying, "Who touched me?" There's an almost cartoonish pileup of bodies as people who are speed walking one moment skid to a stop the next, bumping into one another and stepping on each other's heels. Or at least that's how it goes in my head. The disciples, wanting to regain some order, helpfully speak what's on everyone's mind by saying, "Look, Jesus, there are people everywhere." What kind of a question is that? But Jesus isn't content with the woman staying anonymous or distant. Instead, he waits while she gathers the courage to step out of the crowd and identify herself, telling the whole truth about what just happened. There's this beautiful, intimate moment where Jesus calls her daughter and says, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." This is where I think it's particularly important to remember that this is one larger story. While the woman is healed and speaks with Jesus in front of everyone, Jairus' daughter passes away. A small group from Jairus' household come out to deliver the news, saying that there's no reason to trouble Jesus any longer. The moment of healing for the woman and Jesus' absurd behavior in the middle of the crowd isn't a marginal, quirky side story. It's actually the event that keeps Jesus from his initial priority. What's strange to me is that earlier, Jesus could have let the woman touch his cloak. She could have received his healing power and then gone on her way, healed and well. Maybe that would have given Jesus the time he needed to reach Jairus' daughter in time, without anyone being the wiser. But Jesus stops, asks who touched him, and so delays the entire journey. Maybe Jairus, who has to be close by, was more patient than I would be, because if I were in his shoes at that point, I would have wanted to pull Jesus down the road by his collar, anything to get him to my family sooner. But I think Jesus is making a point here. Many others would have labeled the woman an interruption, just for being who she was. She was a woman, she was poor, and because of her sickness, she would not have been allowed to step foot in the same synagogue that Jairus worked in and worshiped in. But when the woman tells her story, Jesus doesn't hurry her along, but treats her with care and dignity. We've already heard the end of the story. Jesus makes it to Jairus' house and does the miraculous by reviving and healing the young girl. Both the woman and the young girl are healed. What was obnoxious or intrusive or bewildering to the crowd was actually an opportunity for Jesus. Because of how Jesus responds to the interruptions in this passage, we know that God also wants to work in the middle of the interruptions in our lives. Henry Nouwen, who is a Catholic priest and a popular theologian, once wrote, "You know, my whole life I have been complaining that my work was constantly interrupted until I discovered that my interruptions were actually my work." What he's doing here is giving us a picture of the kind of shift in thinking that is a part of spiritual maturity. Throughout the Gospels, we read again and again that Jesus values things and people and events far differently than the world does. So when we commit to following Jesus, we commit to asking God for help with viewing the world from Jesus' perspective. When you think about it, this shift in priorities throughout this passage is just classic Jesus. It's a clear example of the last being first and the first being last. But even those who reach Jesus last are still healed. We tend to assume that one person's gain is another person's loss, or that one unwelcome event has the power to overwhelm any good ones that follow. I think this assumption is what makes interruptions in our lives so difficult. We default to a mindset of scarcity, where there's only so much good to be had in our lives. The story shows that Jesus holds a different view. In today's passage, the woman's interruption doesn't obstruct or end Jesus' work as a healer, it actually expands it. For us, life's interruptions don't have to be a total waste, though they might feel that way in the moment. They're actually another chance for us to expand our awareness of God in our lives so that God can work in the middle of them. A recent interruption from my own life that comes to mind happened only a month ago. I was actually scheduled to be here at St. David's with you all a week earlier than I made it here. I was a week late because just before my first day here, I was in a car accident that wound up totaling my car. No one was injured beyond some bruises and some soreness, thankfully. But over the next week, I scrambled to find and buy a replacement car while handling the insurance claim and postponing all of my summer plans. For that week, each day was just a cycle of looking at used cars all over New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and then just kind of collapsing on my couch each evening. At some point, I realized a coincidence. Recently, I thought maybe I should start praying for help with loosening my grip on the things that I own and the events in my life. So with my car sitting crumpled in the parking lot and a piece of my independence out there with it, here was a situation where I could practice loosening my own grip. Once I realized that, I wasn't incredibly happy about it. I wish that an opportunity to practice reaching out to God would be less obnoxious or less intrusive. But I think we all know that's just not quite how life works. I don't think that God caused my car accident as if this was all a plan to teach me a lesson, just like I don't think God caused the illnesses of the woman or the girl in today's passage. And it's not as if I asked God for help and then stumbled upon an easy solution like some extra room in my own budget. But I do think that I was more aware of God, helping me ease my grip on the control I wanted in my life. And that helped how I acted in my relationships and how I handled the whole thing, actually, which I can only credit to God's grace. I know that life's interruptions can sometimes be easier to handle than a totaled car, or they can be much more difficult. But Jesus is with us no matter the difficulty, and he is not indifferent or naive. He is the one who says, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Amen.
Amen.